By the time it ended, no one was injured. No shouts. No apologies. No explanations. The room was quiet in a way people remembered for years. Those who stood closest would later say it took less than 15 seconds. Not to win, but to settle something that had been building for months. Bruce Lee left the gym the same way he entered it. Walking. Behind him, a group of respected kung fu practitioners stayed where they were. And nothing in that room was the same again. The gym smelled of polished wood and liniment, a mixture that carried years of routine and ritual. Sunlight fell through high windows, cutting through dust motes that lingered in the air like silent witnesses. This was a place where tradition was heavier than the floorboards, where every practitioner knew the weight of lineage, of respect owed and expected. The walls bore trophies and faded calligraphy, reminders of victories earned and reputations maintained. Bruce Lee entered quietly, his shoes barely making a sound. There was no announcement, no declaration of intent. Only the subtle shift in attention, a series of brief glances that acknowledged someone unfamiliar in their carefully ordered system. The masters, all seated along the walls, regarded him with measured curiosity, the way one might observe a new animal in a well-tended garden. They did not rise. They did not speak. Yet, in the stillness, their scrutiny was absolute. Every step Bruce took was deliberate. There was no hurry, no attempt to dominate with presence or volume. He moved as if he belonged to the rhythm of the room, yet somehow outside it. The students, younger men and women, straightened instinctively. They had seen new faces before, but there was something in the alignment of his posture, the economy of his movements, that unsettled even the seasoned observers. It was subtle, almost invisible, yet unmistakable. The environment itself seemed to pause. A slight breeze pushed through an open window, brushing the edges of the hanging scrolls. Each sound, the creak of a floorboard, the distant hum of the city outside, became accentuated by the quiet in the room. Here, mastery was measured in restraint, in the ability to maintain control over both body and impression. And now, Bruce Lee had stepped into this space, an outsider whose very presence challenged the existing order. It was not confrontation that began to form, but expectation. The air grew heavier with it, not in excitement, but in inevitability. Every observer sensed that something would happen, though no one yet knew the form it would take. Bruce Lee did not speak. He did not bow excessively, nor did he assert dominance through ritual. He simply moved with the precision of someone who had nothing to prove, and in doing so, he quietly shifted the balance of the room. A student whispered to another, uncertain, and the sound was immediately swallowed by the larger silence. The masters exchanged glances, subtle, almost imperceptible. Respect, hierarchy, and reputation, all of these were present, but now shadowed by the question of what this outsider represented. In that moment, the room itself became a measure, a silent jury of observation, waiting for the inevitability to unfold. Bruce Lee stood at the center, still watching. He did not seek approval, nor did he provoke. Yet the gym had already begun to recognize him, not for his lineage, not for his credentials, but for the quiet mastery he carried with him into a place that had never seen him before. Every muscle was relaxed but alert. Every gesture was calculated, yet imperceptible in its intent. The challenge had not yet begun, and already, the room had begun to shift. The walls of the gym seemed to contract and expand with the tension, holding decades of discipline and pride. Bruce Lee's presence did not shout. It whispered. And in that whisper, the rules of the room began to bend, imperceptibly but irrevocably. Within minutes, the first chapter of the encounter had been written. Not with fists, nor with speech, but with something far quieter and more decisive. Observation, patience, and a calm that unsettled everyone who bore witness. The stage was set. The room awaited the inevitability that had arrived silently with Bruce Lee. No one moved. No one challenged. And yet, in the stillness, the weight of what was coming pressed on everyone with a gravity they could not ignore. The tension did not announce itself with words. It began in glances, brief and measured, exchanged between the senior masters. They were men who had spent decades cultivating authority, not just over techniques but over the very perception of skill. Bruce Lee was an anomaly, a figure who carried no formal recognition in their circles, yet radiated competence in a way that unsettled the carefully maintained order. One of the older masters, known for his sharp critiques and unwavering adherence to tradition, shifted in his seat. It was a subtle motion, almost imperceptible, but it carried the weight of questioning. His eyes followed Bruce's movements, tracking each step, each shift of weight, as though trying to read a book written in a language he did not fully understand. The room was quiet, yet the air felt dense with the unspoken. Legitimacy versus defiance, old guard versus outsider. No one spoke directly at first. The challenge was not verbal. It existed in the very act of observation. Bruce Lee moved through the hall, circling slightly, adjusting his stance as if responding to invisible cues. Each motion was economical, precise, measured. He did not demonstrate, did not perform. And yet, every movement conveyed a message. Competence is not declared, it is recognized. Whispers rippled among the younger students. Who is he? Where did he train? Why hasn't anyone stopped him? But the veterans, the masters whose authority had been established over years, maintained silence. Their resistance was not physical. It was psychological, rooted in the preservation of hierarchy and the fear of being overshadowed. They had seen challenges before, but this was not a typical challenge. Bruce's presence alone implied an equivalence they were not prepared to confront. One master finally broke the quiet, not with anger, but with a controlled, precise question. "Do you claim to be better than us?" His voice was calm, almost rhetorical, yet it carried the weight of expectation. Bruce Lee did not answer directly. He only acknowledged the question with a brief, measured pause, letting the silence that followed serve as response. In that pause, the room understood. He did not need to assert superiority. It was already present. The observers felt the shift. Respect, fear, curiosity. They were no longer separate, but intertwined in a subtle tension that wrapped around the room. The traditional hierarchy, once unquestioned, began to feel fragile. The masters realized that Bruce Lee's authority did not require validation. It existed independently, quietly unyielding. This chapter of the encounter was not about striking or proving skill. It was about presence, about the way one individual could quietly disrupt established order without aggression. Each master wrestled with internal conflict, to maintain control through protocol, or to confront something that exceeded protocol entirely. The tension mounted not through action, but through silent measurement, a weighing of credibility that only those steeped in tradition could fully perceive. Even the students, who had been trained to observe and emulate, recognized the anomaly. They saw a different kind of authority, fluid, adaptive, and internalized. Bruce Lee did not seek recognition. He provoked it simply by existing within a space that had rules and expectations he had not asked to follow. As the moments stretched, the inevitability began to assert itself more clearly. The room, which had existed in equilibrium, could no longer maintain balance. A confrontation was forming, though it was neither verbal nor physical. It was a test of composure, perception, and the subtle mastery that had quietly accompanied Bruce Lee into the hall. By the end of the chapter, the atmosphere was taut. Resistance had been established, but it had already begun to bend under the weight of calm, controlled authority. The masters knew that what was about to unfold would be decisive, not because of force, but because of inevitability. Bruce Lee's silent assertion had already begun to erode the boundaries of their world, leaving them with only one option: to face what could not be ignored. By mid-morning, word of the gathering had spread beyond the walls of the hall. The city's small martial arts community, usually dispersed across its gyms and dojos, felt a subtle ripple, as if a single stone had been dropped into a still pond. Observers began to appear, not to intervene but to witness. Some were casual students, curious about rumors. Others were practitioners with reputations of their own, drawn by the sense that something rare was unfolding. Inside the hall, the presence of outsiders added a new layer of pressure. The masters, who had so far maintained composure, now shifted imperceptibly under the weight of watching eyes. The room felt smaller, even though its dimensions had not changed. Each footstep in the corridor outside echoed like a drumbeat, emphasizing the unspoken expectation that a demonstration, however brief, was imminent. Bruce Lee did not react to the growing audience. His movements remained minimal. A slight adjustment of stance, a measured turn of the head, a hand brushing lightly across the floor as if acknowledging its texture. He did not glance at the newcomers, nor did he accelerate his actions. And yet, their very presence amplified the tension. Silence became collective, a shared attention that hung thick between the floorboards and ceiling beams. Observers later recalled that even those closest to the door could sense the inevitability. There was no chatter, no speculation allowed. Only the subtle awareness that something precise, something decisive, was about to occur. It was as if the hall itself had become a lens, focusing attention on a single point where time seemed to slow, compressing expectation into an almost tangible form. Among the masters, quiet calculations began. The hierarchy they had relied upon was no longer sufficient. Their authority had always been reinforced by ritual, by years of observation and repetition. Yet Bruce Lee operated outside of those systems, demonstrating that mastery could exist independently of ritualized validation. Their internal debate was invisible to casual observers. To uphold tradition, or to confront the reality of skill manifested in minimal, precise motion. Whispers surfaced again, this time restrained by the weight of shared recognition. He moves differently, not like us. I've never seen such control. It's not speed, it's something else. The room, full of witnesses, became a collective mind attempting to interpret a phenomenon it had not anticipated. Bruce Lee did not explain. He did not adjust his pace or posture to satisfy curiosity. The very subtlety of his presence became a psychological signal that spoke louder than any demonstration could. The crowd leaned in both literally and figuratively. Students shifted forward on their toes. Observers held their breath, consciously or unconsciously. Even the masters, whose training had taught patience above all, were drawn into the silent anticipation. The air seemed to hum, carrying the weight of years of unspoken rules now facing an unknown variable. No one could predict what would happen next. Yet the inevitability, already planted in the room before the crowd arrived, had grown. It was not fear. It was not excitement. It was recognition. Something was about to conclude, and it would leave a lasting impression on everyone present. Bruce Lee had not changed his demeanor. He remained calm, measured, almost unremarkable in appearance. And that calmness, in contrast to the mounting tension around him, became the axis around which the room turned. By the end of this chapter, the hall was full not of noise, but of attention. Every eye, every subtle posture, every breath became part of an unspoken consensus. A demonstration was inevitable, and nothing within the room could prevent it. The stage was set for what would come next, the demonstration that would be brief, precise, and unforgettable. It began and ended in a way that almost defied description. 15 seconds, or perhaps slightly more according to some witnesses, was all it took. Yet within that span, the room's entire dynamic shifted, as if time itself had slowed to accommodate observation. Bruce Lee did not shout. He did not assume a formal stance. There was no ceremonial exchange, no flourish of technique meant to impress. Only motion, minimal, deliberate, and incomprehensibly precise. Observers would later argue about what they had seen. Some claimed he moved almost imperceptibly, shifting his weight and balance to intercept intention before it had fully formed. Others described it as a sequence of adjustments so subtle that a casual eye would have dismissed them entirely. What they all agreed upon was the result. The masters, the so-called authorities of the hall, had been rendered immobile, not out of pain but out of dissonance. Their expectations, their assumptions about confrontation and skill, had collapsed under the quiet demonstration of mastery. Bruce's movements were not about power. They were about inevitability. Each step, each micro-adjustment of posture, served to expose gaps in the other's understanding, gaps they had not realized existed until they were confronted. There were no strikes thrown, no contact necessary. The demonstration existed purely in control of distance, timing, and perception. The observers, even those at the back of the room, felt its impact. The masters themselves had no words to describe it. The room seemed to breathe differently. A shift in collective awareness passed from one person to the next. Those who had come expecting a spectacle of strength or aggression found instead a study in efficiency and restraint. The students, the silent witnesses, realized that technique was not merely physical. It was psychological, a negotiation of presence and anticipation. Bruce Lee's authority did not demand recognition. It elicited it by default. There was no rush, no theatrics. He did not accelerate to display speed. He did not gesture to dominate. Instead, the demonstration unfolded in a rhythm so controlled that it felt inevitable, almost like the natural conclusion of a quiet argument the room had been having with itself. By the time the last micro-movement had passed, the silence that followed was absolute. Even the air seemed to hold its breath, carrying the weight of realization across the polished wood floor. For the masters, the effect was disorienting. Their skill, honed over decades, had been confronted by something they had not trained for. A mastery that was not aggressive, yet entirely dominant. It was not a question of winning or losing. The conventional metrics no longer applied. The collapse was internal, psychological, an acknowledgement that the rules they had relied upon were insufficient. Witnesses later described the scene with similar adjectives: quiet, inevitable, unnerving. Some recalled the subtle nods of recognition passing between Bruce Lee and the masters, as though he had merely acknowledged their presence, not challenged it. Others remembered the faintest exhale, the moment when tension released collectively, signaling understanding without uttering a word. And then it was over. 15 seconds. Give or take. The masters remained standing, but they were not the same. Their authority, once unquestioned, had been reframed. Students and observers alike sensed it. Mastery could exist beyond hierarchy, beyond lineage, and without confrontation. The demonstration had communicated more than technique. It had communicated the quiet power of inevitability. Bruce Lee stepped back, breathing even, his posture unchanged. He had not sought applause. He had not demanded acknowledgement. He had simply moved, and in doing so, he had rewritten the room's understanding of skill, control, and psychological authority. In that moment, no one spoke, not because they were fearful, but because the room required reflection. The demonstration had completed its purpose, not to dominate in the conventional sense, but to assert a form of authority that was absolute in its restraint, precise in its efficiency, and enduring in its psychological effect. The moment the demonstration ended, the room did not erupt. There were no shouts, no motions to recover pride, no heated debates. Instead, a different kind of collapse began, subtle, internal, and unavoidable. The masters, who had long relied on the solidity of tradition and the predictability of protocol, felt the foundation shift beneath them. Their authority, unquestioned for decades, now seemed provisional, fragile. The silence was not empty. It was filled with recognition of something that could not be challenged through conventional means. Confidence, which had always been measured in posture, technique, and reputation, began to drain quietly from the room. Even those who had been skeptical, who had doubted Bruce Lee's abilities or intent, now felt it. A recalibration of understanding, an acknowledgement that the hierarchy they depended upon no longer governed the situation. Students and witnesses noticed the effect immediately. The younger practitioners, who had been trained to emulate without question, saw hesitation where certainty once existed. Movements slowed, eyes flickered nervously, and whispers were swallowed before they could fully form. For the first time, the room was ruled not by tradition, but by observation, by the unspoken authority of a presence that required no enforcement. The masters themselves did not articulate the collapse. There was no argument or concession. It was evident in posture, in the way their hands remained at their sides instead of gesturing, in the subtle stiffness that replaced fluidity. One by one, the structures of pride and control they had built over years yielded to an undeniable truth. Mastery, when fully realized, does not need to prove itself through force or spectacle. Bruce Lee, standing quietly at the center, did nothing further. He did not approach, did not gesture, did not demand acknowledgement. His calm persisted, a counterpoint to the internal upheaval of those around him. The collapse was complete precisely because he had not acted in the way they expected. Power, unannounced and unexaggerated, had redefined the room. Observers later reflected that the lesson was subtle but permanent. The shift was not physical. No injuries were sustained, no techniques had been beaten into submission. The collapse existed entirely within the psyche of the witnesses, an invisible reshaping of understanding. It was a recalibration that required no audience applause and left no immediate trace other than the quiet recognition that the rules of authority had changed. For the masters, this collapse was a long, silent reckoning. The authority they had exercised for years was still their own, but it now existed in dialogue with something new, a demonstration of skill and presence that demanded acknowledgement without confrontation. They were not humiliated in the conventional sense. They were confronted with inevitability, and inevitability, as they would learn, is more enduring than any victory gained through force. By the time Bruce Lee stepped away, the room had completed its transformation. Students whispered cautiously among themselves, their voices hushed not out of fear, but out of reverence for what had been silently demonstrated. Observers understood that they had witnessed something rare. A reshaping of hierarchy, a demonstration of psychological dominance without aggression, and the quiet assertion of mastery that left its mark long before anyone spoke. The collapse was not dramatic. It had no flair, no spectacle, but it was complete, absolute, and enduring. The room, once a place of rigid structure, now carried a memory of inevitability, a subtle, persistent reminder that true authority manifests without noise, without boast, and without the need to strike. Years passed, yet the story of that day did not fade. The gym continued to operate, the masters continued to teach, and students continued to train. But the quiet impact of those 15 seconds lingered in ways that were hard to quantify. Visitors who had been present spoke less of Bruce Lee himself, and more of what his presence had revealed. The subtle power of mastery, the weight of inevitability, and the recalibration of respect that required no ceremony. The masters, in particular, carried the memory privately. Their public demeanor remained composed, but the internal hierarchy had shifted. They no longer measured authority solely by tradition or lineage. Skill could exist independently of ritual. Presence could command without confrontation. They rarely spoke of it, and when they did, it was in measured tones, almost reluctantly, as if recounting a lesson learned without being asked. Students recounted it differently. For them, the incident became a touchstone. It was referenced quietly during training sessions, often without naming Bruce Lee. "Watch how he moves," they would say, or "Notice what is left unspoken." The lesson was encoded in observation and reflection rather than instruction, passed down to successive generations with the subtlety of a whispered truth. The gym itself retained the echoes of that day. The polished wood floors seemed to carry memory. The walls seemed to have absorbed the tension and its resolution. New students, entering years later, would sometimes pause unconsciously at the center of the hall, sensing the weight of a presence that had long since left. The effect was not supernatural. It was psychological, a quiet reminder that mastery leaves traces beyond what can be measured in techniques or trophies. Bruce Lee's demonstration became legend not because of spectacle, but because of its lasting influence. Witnesses recalled that no one had been defeated physically. No one had been struck, yet the hierarchy had shifted irrevocably. Respect was no longer demanded. It was earned silently, in observation and recognition of inevitability. Stories of the event circulated, altered slightly with each telling, but always maintaining the essential truth: that quiet authority could reshape even the most established structures. The long-term impact extended beyond the gym. Students carried the lesson into other schools, into their own practice, and into the ways they measured skill and influence. Observers who had witnessed it described it as a moment that reframed their understanding of conflict and control. It was not about aggression. It was about presence, efficiency, and the capacity to assert dominance without assertion. In the decades that followed, the story was cited as a benchmark of psychological mastery. Yet those who recounted it consistently emphasized its subtlety. It was not a tale of victory, nor of ego. It was a lesson in inevitability, in the quiet reshaping of perception, and in the power of restraint. Those who were present remembered the 15 seconds not for their brevity, but for the depth of understanding that they unlocked. The legacy endured because it was understated. Bruce Lee had left no mark in the form of trophies or records, but in the minds of those who had observed, he had demonstrated a principle far more lasting: that true mastery commands acknowledgement not through force, but through control, presence, and the quiet articulation of skill that cannot be denied. Even decades later, when students and masters retell the story, it is never about Bruce Lee as a man. It is about what happened in the room, how the unspoken rules of hierarchy bent, and how a single, silent demonstration became a measure against which all future encounters would be understood. The gym, the masters, the students, they all carried it forward, a living lesson in authority, inevitability, and the enduring weight of mastery achieved without boast or strike. The room remained quiet long after he had left, and in that quiet, the lesson continued to resonate, a slow-burning echo that taught more than words ever could.